One's a YouTube disruptor who turned controversy into pay-per-views. Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis isn't just a fight, it's a culture clash. Internet hype collides with pure skill, and fans can't stop asking, what happens if these two worlds finally meet in the ring? Jake Paul's story reads like something out of a modern sports drama. He didn't come from a boxing gym in Philadelphia or a fighting family in Mexico. He came from YouTube, a platform built on pranks, skits, and controversy. Alongside his brother Logan, Jake built a massive online following, but also a reputation as one of the internet's most hated figures. Fights in public, scandals, viral stunts. Jake was the villain people loved to click on, and he knew it. But then, something changed. In 2018, Jake put on boxing gloves for a white-collar amateur fight on a YouTube undercard, and fans laughed at the spectacle. Nobody expected him to take it seriously. Yet instead of walking away, Jake leaned in. He trained, he sparred, and in 2020, he began fighting professionally. First, it was influencers like Son Gibb. Then, in the viral KO that broke Twitter, he flattened ex-NBA star Nate Robinson. Suddenly, the YouTube kid was being talked about on ESPN and boxing forums. Jake's genius wasn't just throwing punches, it was selling stories. He called out MMA stars like Ben Askren and Tyron Woodley, turning trash talk into pay-per-view headliners. When he fought Anderson Silva, a UFC legend, even skeptics had to admit Jake could box. He wasn't elite, but he wasn't a joke either. He built MVP promotions, signed fighters, and made himself one of the most marketable names in the sport without ever fighting a ranked pro boxer. For purists, he was an intruder. For casual fans, he was the bridge into boxing they never cared about before. That's Jake Paul's power. He makes people care, even if it's just to see him lose. And in that sense, every step of his career has been building toward one question. What happens when Jake finally faces someone who's truly elite? If Jake Paul is the outsider who barged into boxing's house, Gervonta Davis is the chosen son, raised inside its walls. Born and raised in Baltimore, Tank's childhood was marked by hardship and chaos. The streets were unforgiving, and like many young men in his neighborhood, trouble was always close by. But when Tank stepped into Upton Boxing Gym under the guidance of Coach Calvin Ford, he found something rare: discipline, focus, and a future. From the start, Tank had one thing you can't teach: fight-ending power. Even in the amateurs, opponents felt his punches differently. He racked up over 200 amateur wins before turning pro at just 18. By 22, he was already a world champion. And under the mentorship of Floyd Mayweather, Tank became one of boxing's fastest rising stars. Mayweather called him the future of boxing. And fight by fight, Tank proved him right. His highlight reel is a collection of viral knockouts. The uppercut that nearly decapitated Leo Santa Cruz. The one-punch finish against Rolando Romero. The body shot that folded Ryan Garcia in front of millions. At just 5 feet 5 inches, Tank fights like a loaded spring, patient but always coiled, waiting for the moment to detonate. His record? Undefeated. His reputation? The most feared puncher in the lighter weight classes. Tank isn't just a boxer. He's a symbol of pure pedigree. He represents the exact opposite of Jake Paul's route. No shortcuts, no clout chasing, just years of grind, sweat, and discipline. And that's what makes the matchup so fascinating. On one side, Jake Paul, the disruptor who turned fame into fights. On the other, Gervonta Davis, the purist's nightmare for anyone who dares disrespect the sport. The question isn't just who wins, it's what happens when YouTube confidence meets Baltimore power. Boxing fans love debates, but few potential fights stir up more chaos than Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis. On paper, it doesn't make sense. Jake fights around cruiserweight, standing 6 feet 1 inch with natural size. Tank dominates at lightweight and super lightweight, standing 5 feet 5 inches. The weight gap is enormous, and yet the internet can't stop talking about it. Why? Because it's more than a fight. It's a culture war. Jake has spent years calling out names bigger than him: Canelo Alvarez, Nate Diaz, even Mike Tyson. But when he set his sights on Gervonta Davis, it was different. Tank isn't retired. He isn't past his prime. He's not a crossover fighter dipping his toes in boxing. He's one of the most dangerous active champions alive. For purists, the idea of Jake sharing a ring with Tank is insulting. For Jake's fans, it's the ultimate underdog fantasy. The internet star versus the pound-for-pound killer. And in the age of social media, fantasy sells as much as reality. Clips of Jake calling out Tank spread like wildfire. Memes flooded timelines. Boxing analysts debated whether Jake's size advantage could matter against Tank's speed and power. Some fans argued it was impossible, that Tank would annihilate him in a round. Others insisted Jake's weight and reach could create chaos nobody expected. That's the magic of this matchup. It's polarizing, it's unlikely, but it's irresistible. It's Mayweather versus McGregor all over again. Purists scoffing while casual fans salivate. And the more fans argue, the more money the idea generates. The obsession isn't really about who wins, it's about what the fight represents. If Jake survived Tank, it would shake boxing's hierarchy to its core. If Tank destroyed Jake, it would restore order, proving once again that clout can't beat class. Either way, the hype is unstoppable. And that's why fans can't stop asking the same question: what if it actually happened? Boxing has always been about two things: the fight in the ring and the business outside it. And if we're talking about Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis, the business side is where things get both fascinating and complicated. On Jake's end, the blueprint is already clear. He's built MVP promotions into a powerhouse for crossover events with deals that pull in celebrities, athletes, and influencers under one banner. He knows how to hype a fight, how to turn Twitter spats into ESPN headlines, and how to make casual fans open their wallets. His fights against Tyron Woodley and Anderson Silva showed that he can sell out arenas and pull in respectable pay-per-view numbers. When Jake is involved, spectacle is guaranteed, and spectacle sells. On Tank's side, the path looks different. He's not an internet star. He doesn't flood social media with call-outs or antics. His draw comes from pedigree, an undefeated record, highlight reel knockouts, and the aura of a fighter who destroys almost everyone in his path. Backed early in his career by Floyd Mayweather, Tank learned the business from one of the best. Now, with his profile soaring after his mega fight with Ryan Garcia, Tank has established himself as a proven pay-per-view star. He doesn't need Jake Paul to sell, but Jake Paul might need him to finally cross into real legitimacy. The financial argument for this fight is undeniable. Crossover bouts like Mayweather versus McGregor or Fury versus Ngannou proved that curiosity can generate staggering numbers. Hardcore fans might roll their eyes, but millions of casuals tune in when two worlds collide. Jake brings the mainstream, Tank brings credibility. Together, they could break records, but making the fight isn't simple. Weight is a massive issue. Jake fights at cruiserweight, while Tank dominates at lightweight. That's nearly a 30-pound gap. Contracts, catchweights, and rehydration clauses would all have to be negotiated. On top of that, both men have egos and brands to protect. Tank won't risk being part of a circus unless the payday is astronomical. Jake won't step in unless the marketing ensures maximum attention. And yet, boxing history tells us one thing: if the money is big enough, obstacles don't matter. Fighters retire, unretire, move weight classes, and sign impossible contracts when paydays reach life-changing levels. So could Jake versus Tank be made? Logistically difficult, financially tempting, culturally explosive. And that's why fans can't stop talking about it, because deep down, they know in boxing, if the money's right, even the impossible becomes inevitable. Strip away the business, and what makes Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis so captivating is the pure clash of style. On one side, Jake, 6 feet 1 inch, 200 pounds, naturally bigger, longer, and stronger than nearly every man Tank has ever fought. On the other, Tank, 5 feet 5 inches, compact, explosive, with some of the most devastating knockout power in boxing today. It's not just a fight, it's a physics experiment. Jake's strengths are obvious. He's a natural cruiserweight with a solid jab and decent fundamentals for someone who's only been boxing professionally a few years. Against Anderson Silva, he showed patience, composure, and the ability to go rounds with a skilled veteran. He's not fast, but he's strong, and his right hand carries legitimate power. Against opponents his own size, Jake has proven he can land clean shots and change the pace of a fight. But then there's Tank. What he lacks in size, he makes up for in timing, precision, and raw knockout power. Time and again, Tank has shown he can close the distance against taller fighters. Leo Santa Cruz was 5 feet 7 inches with a longer reach. Tank walked him down and ended the fight with a single uppercut. Ryan Garcia stood 5 feet 10 inches with blazing hand speed. Tank found his timing and ended the night with a body shot that folded Garcia in two. It doesn't matter how tall his opponents are, Tank always finds a way in. The danger for Jake isn't just Tank's power, it's his explosiveness. Tank doesn't throw punches in bunches. He lulls opponents into a false sense of security, then detonates with one perfectly timed shot. Against someone as inexperienced as Jake, Tank's ability to capitalize on small mistakes could be fatal. A lazy jab, a dropped guard, a slow step back. That's all Tank needs to end it. And yet, Jake's size isn't meaningless. Boxing is full of stories where bigger men use their reach and bulk to smother smaller punchers. If Jake could establish his jab, keep Tank at a distance, and lean on his weight in clinches, he could make the fight ugly. Add in the fact that Tank would likely have to jump 2 or 3 weight classes just to meet Jake, and suddenly, the physical mismatch doesn't look entirely one-sided. So which wins? Tank's skill and knockout precision, or Jake's sheer size and improving fundamentals? That's the stylistic puzzle that keeps fans debating. It's David versus Goliath, but in this story, both men are dangerous in their own way. If there's one thing Jake Paul does better than anyone, it's selling fights. He doesn't just box, he creates narratives. Every press conference, every tweet, tweet, every Instagram story is part of a bigger play, making people care. And if this fight with Tank ever came close to happening, the hype would be nothing short of electric. Jake's strategy is simple but effective. Get under his opponent's skin. He'll mock their size, their career, their fan base. He'll post memes, stage stunts, and bait headlines. Against Tyron Woodley, he turned "I love Jake Paul" into a bet that ran across every sports page. Against Nate Diaz, he used trash talk to stir up old-school MMA fans and make them tune in just to watch him get punched. Imagine what he'd do with Gervonta Davis, a real champion with real credentials. Jake would position himself as the underdog disruptor, painting Tank as the establishment he's here to tear down. But Tank isn't the type to play Jake's game. He's not a talker, he's an intimidator. While Jake thrives on chaos, Tank thrives on silence. He doesn't need a microphone to make a point. His fists have written his story across the faces of 30 opponents. His persona is calm, almost detached, until the moment comes when he explodes. That dynamic, Jake the loudmouth versus Tank the silent killer, would make every press event a must-watch. Picture the press tour. Jake cracking jokes, waving props, calling Tank too small to hurt him. Tank sitting stone-faced, maybe smirking, maybe muttering a single warning. The tension would be unbearable. Every stare-down would feel like a fuse being lit. Fans wouldn't just be waiting for fight night. They'd be glued to every interaction in the build-up, knowing the hype might boil over into something unforgettable. And then there's the media circus. ESPN, YouTube, boxing podcasts, TikTok, all would explode with clips and debates. Memes would flood Twitter. Fans would argue in comment sections, creating free promotion with every insult and hot take. That's the Jake Paul effect. He makes everyone part of the show, whether they like him or not. But here's the catch. Fights aren't won in press conferences. Trash talk builds tension, but when the bell rings, hype disappears. And that's what makes this matchup so fascinating. Jake might win the build-up, Tank might win the stare-downs, but in the end, the truth would come out in the ring. And for fans, that's exactly why the hype machine works. It convinces you that maybe, just maybe, the fight won't go the way you think. Imagine the scene. Las Vegas, Madison Square Garden, maybe even Saudi Arabia, where mega money fights have become the new norm. Celebrities in the front row, actors, rappers, athletes, holding their phones high as Jake Paul and Gervonta Davis make their ring walks. The air is electric, split between curiosity and bloodlust. Half the crowd wants Jake humiliated, half wants him to shock the world. Everyone agrees on one thing: they can't look away. Jake would likely walk out first, showboating under lights, maybe with a rapper or influencer at his side. He'd soak in the boos and cheers equally, because for him, attention is currency. Tank would follow, calm, focused, walking to the ring with the same ice-cold stare that has preceded every knockout of his career. His demeanor says everything. This isn't a circus for him, it's another victim on the list. When the bell rings, the tension reaches a breaking point. Jake, the bigger man, would try to establish his jab early. He'd circle, paw, and use his reach to keep Tank outside. The question would hang heavy in the arena. Can Jake keep Tank at bay long enough to land something meaningful? For the first minute or two, maybe he could. His size alone would buy him space. But Tank is patient. He's made a career out of starting slow, downloading data, then striking with devastating precision. The crowd would buzz every time Tank closed distance, every time he slipped a jab to move into Jake's chest. Analysts at ringside would be holding their breath, waiting for that signature Davis detonation. The middle rounds are where the fight could swing. If Jake survives Tank's early traps, he might begin leaning on his size, clinching, and pushing Tank around. Each second he lasts would fuel the underdog narrative. Twitter would explode with fans saying, Jake might actually do this. But survival isn't victory, and everyone watching would know that Tank only needs one clean shot to end the night. When that shot comes, it would feel inevitable. Maybe it's an uppercut slipped inside Jake's jab. Maybe it's a left hand over the top when Jake backs straight up. Whatever the weapon, Tank has dozens. The image of Jake crumpling to the canvas, eyes wide, stunned that this is real boxing, would go viral instantly. Clips would flood every platform, headlines screaming, Tank destroys Jake Paul. But what if Jake didn't crumble? What if he stayed on his feet, ate a few shots, and kept firing back? Even losing on points, the very act of surviving Tank Davis would shift the narrative. Suddenly, Jake wouldn't just be the YouTuber dabbling in boxing. He'd be the man who stood up to one of the sport's most feared punchers. That's why Fight Night would be so magnetic. Fans wouldn't just be watching for the result. They'd be watching to see whether Jake's chin, heart, and hype could survive reality colliding with it. Every fight has stakes, but a fight like Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis carries weight far beyond the ring. For Jake, this wouldn't just be another paycheck or a chance to trend online. This would be his legacy-defining moment. If he beat Tank, or even survived competitively, he would silence critics forever. No more talk of him fighting retired MMA fighters or washed legends. He'd have tested himself against one of the sport's most dangerous champions. Even a loss could enhance his credibility if he lasted long enough. But if Tank obliterated him, all of Jake's hard work building legitimacy could vanish overnight. He'd be remembered not as the disruptor who changed boxing, but as the influencer who finally got exposed. For Gervonta Davis, the stakes are different, but just as real. Tank has spent years building his brand as one of boxing's elite. To risk it against Jake Paul, someone purists see as a sideshow, carries danger. If Tank won, many would shrug and say, of course he did. But if he lost, even in fluke fashion, the damage would be catastrophic. His reputation as a pound-for-pound star could crumble, overshadowed by the stigma of losing to a YouTuber. That's why purists scoff at the idea. The risk-to-reward ratio seems insane. For boxing itself, the stakes might be highest of all. The sport has struggled for years with fractured promotions, declining mainstream attention, and accusations of being too slow to make big fights happen. Jake Paul has injected new energy, bringing casual fans into arenas and onto pay-per-view platforms. But every crossover spectacle also risks cheapening the sport's traditions. If Tank crushed Jake, purists would cheer, seeing it as a restoration of order. If Jake held his own, or worse, pulled off a miracle upset, the sport would be forced to reckon with a new reality where clout and reach matter as much as skill. The cultural stakes stretch further. For Jake's generation of fans, this fight would symbolize the triumph of internet-born celebrities over traditional institutions. For Tank's supporters, it would be proof that discipline and pedigree still rule the day. Every round, every punch would feel like a referendum on more than two men. It would be about what boxing is and what it's becoming. That's why this hypothetical matchup resonates so deeply. It's not just about belts or records, it's about respect, credibility, and the shifting balance between old-school purity and new-school disruption. And in that sense, the stakes are higher than almost any fight Jake, or even Tank, has ever faced. When fans debate Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis, they're not just debating a fight, they're debating the future of boxing culture. Legacy is what separates spectacle from history. And no matter how it ended, this fight would leave a permanent mark. For Jake Paul, victory would make him one of the most disruptive forces boxing has ever seen. He wouldn't just be a YouTuber dabbling in the sport, he'd be the man who beat, or at least stood toe-to-toe with, a pound-for-pound elite. His name would live alongside other cultural crossovers like Conor McGregor stepping into the boxing ring against Mayweather, or Muhammad Ali fighting Antonio Inoki in a mixed-rules spectacle. Even in defeat, if Jake lasted rounds or pushed Tank harder than expected, his credibility would rise. He'd move from curiosity to legitimate draw. For Tank, a win would solidify his place not just as a knockout artist, but as a crossover star. Boxing's greats don't just fight champions, they fight icons, spectacles, and events that transcend the sport. Beating Jake Paul would give him mainstream attention far beyond boxing circles, but legacy is a double-edged sword. If Tank lost, or even struggled, his carefully built aura could suffer. A single punch from Jake landing clean could shift the narrative forever, no matter what the record books say. For boxing culture, the fight would serve as a mirror. Purists would see it as either validation, if Tank dominated, or a wake-up call, if Jake survived. Casual fans would view it as proof that boxing is still the most unpredictable theater in sports. And promoters would see dollar signs, realizing once again that crossover fights, however controversial, are the ones that break through to the mainstream. The cultural impact would extend beyond the ring. Debates on Twitter, TikTok edits, YouTube breakdowns, all would ensure the fight lived far past the final bell. Like Mayweather-McGregor or Fury-Ngannou, this wouldn't just be remembered as a fight. It would be remembered as a cultural event, a point in time when boxing's old guard and new guard collided in spectacular fashion. And that's why Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis matters, even if it never happens. Because the legacy isn't just about who wins or loses, it's about what the fight represents.